The Iliad, Omnibus 4. If there is such a thing as classical literature, then then the Iliad has to be considered in the front rank of such literature. This was one of the foundational works for Greek civilization, and it has been a significant player in the formation of our own civilization. It's one of the most studied and praised classical works of all time. Although it is set in an ancient world, a world largely unknown to us, the great themes of the poem have been accessible to readers ever since the poem was first composed, down to the present. The glory and tragedy of war are as much with us today as they were then, and the temptations ever present in warfare are as relevant to us as they were to Achilles and Hector. The Iliad, set in the midst of the Trojan War, is followed by the Odyssey, which is Homer's account of Odysseus trying to get home to Ithaca after the war. Normally, these two works are read and studied in their natural chronological order, but because the Odyssey is less difficult and more accessible, that book was studied in Omnibus 1. Now that we are in Omnibus 4 and all grown up, it is time to tackle this more challenging work. General information. Arthur in context. We know that Homer was a very great poetic genius, but we know very little else about him. He was blind, as many ancient poets were, and that is almost all we can say. At the same time, some educated speculations are possible. He was probably a Greek from the colonies in Ionia, which means that he lived generally where the Trojans used to live. We may remember Mark Twain's joke now that we know that the works of Homer were not by him, but rather were the work of another blind Greek poet with the same name. Although the dating of his life is also uncertain, we may tentatively follow the dating of Herodotus and place him in the 8th century BC. This would make him a rough contemporary of the prophet Isaiah. The Trojan War itself happened some several centuries before that. Significance. What we have to say about the Iliad is very similar to what was said about the significance of the Odyssey. The central organizing principle of any culture is the religion of that culture. In a certain sense, following the observation of Henry Van Til, we may say that culture is religion externalized, but the carrier of religion is language, and the standardizing carrier of language is literature. And every body of literature has a canonical center. That is why, for example, Homer's Iliad has had the same kind of impact on ancient Greek culture that the King James Version of the Bible had on 17th century English-speaking peoples. It helped to shape the Greeks into a people and was a very potent shaping force. Not only was this the case for the Greeks, but because of the position the Greeks had in the history of Western culture, the Iliad also has had a continuing effect down to the present. After all, you are studying this work now for a reason. Main characters. Achilles is the main character of this story. Indeed, it would be safe to say the poem is more about the fall of Achilles than about the fall of Troy. Hector is the champion defender of the Trojans. Agamemnon is the commander of the Greek expedition and one of their chief kings. Menelaus is Agamemnon's brother and the cuckold husband of Helen. Odysseus is one of the leading Greek warriors, a very crafty man. Patroclus, is the warrior who dies while fighting in Achilles' armor, fighting in his place. Diomedes is another leading Greek warrior. Paris is the Trojan prince who ran off with Helen, the wife of Menelaus, while starting the hostilities. Gods and goddesses who are important in this story are Zeus, Hera, Ares, and Aphrodite. Summary and setting. Some of the backstory for this poem is not found in the story itself, but was clearly assumed by all who heard it. Paris was dragooned into being the judge of a beauty contest between three goddesses, Hera, Athene, and Aphrodite, which is always a bad idea. If you were ever asked to do this, say no quite firmly. After the competition was underway, the goddesses offered Paris various inducements that would cause him to pick the right one. Aphrodite, who clearly knew the caliber of her man, offered him the most beautiful woman in the world. That turned out to be Helen, unfortunately already married, but Paris headed back to Troy with her anyway. When Helen was being courted initially by Menelaus, her father had required all the suitors to take an oath that they would come together in an alliance if anybody tried funny business with Helen. This is why what should have been a private quarrel between Menelaus and Paris turned into a war between the city of Troy and the various city-states of the Greeks. Near the end of 10 years of fighting at Troy, a dispute broke out among the Greeks who had been besieging Troy. Agamemnon was forced by circumstances to give up his war trophy concubine, which he refused to do unless she was replaced by one of the concubines of the other leaders in the Greek camp. He winds up taking Briseis, the concubine of Achilles. This infuriates Achilles, who withdraws from the fighting, thus giving a great temporary advantage to the Trojans. Achilles, his pride badly stung, refuses to come back into the fighting until Patroclus, fighting in his stead, falls in battle. Achilles then comes back into the war, kills Hector, and grossly dishonors his body. Priam, the king of Troy and father of Hector, comes to Achilles and begs for the return of the body, which Achilles finally grants. The setting of the story is near the fall of Troy, although the city does not fall in the poem. This would take place around 1100 BC, or shortly before the time of King David, during the period of the Judges in the Bible. This would make Hector and Achilles and Odysseus contemporaries with the prophet Samuel. Worldview. Modern Istanbul is 726 miles from modern Jerusalem. This means that ancient Jerusalem was 726 miles from the site where Istanbul now is, which is just down the road a bit from ancient Troy. That means that the prophet Samuel, had he wanted to, could have walked that distance in about a month with his hands in his pockets. Other forms of quicker transportation were available as well, whether by sail or horseback. The point being made here is that the biblical world, so familiar to many Christian students, was a nearby part of the same world you will read about here in this epic poem. The gods worshipped by the pagans and the demonic forces opposed by faithful Jews were the same entities. The tactics of warfare were the same. Their methods of transport and manufacturing were the same. Their nations surrounded the same Mediterranean Sea. It is therefore important for us to begin by reviewing briefly a few of the points made in the worldview essay for the Odyssey. First, the student should always remember that the basic framework of religion seen throughout the lines of the Iliad is the kind of religion continually opposed in the pages of the Bible. But this opposition does not consist of maintaining that the gods of the heathen were fictitious. No, in the Bible, these were real evil realities. Not every story told of the gods and goddesses was true, obviously, but the Bible does assume the basic reality of such beings, and therefore, so should we. In doing this, we do not grant the background claims that the pagans made about the nature of reality, but we do assert that they were distorting some things that really were there. Basic to the biblical position on God is that of understanding the creator-creature distinction, with the triune God on one side and all of creation on the other. God transcends the world and is fundamentally distinct from all his creatures. The rival conception to this is necessarily that of a great chain of being. In this chain, all beings are similar in principle, and no great gap exists in the chain anywhere. Some beings are greater and some are lesser, obviously, but all inhabit the same reality. In this kind of belief system, everything runs together at some point, including the concept of humanity and deity. As I pointed out in the worldview essay on the Odyssey, it does not matter how high the staircase goes if each step is just 8 inches higher than the previous one. For the pagan, beings significantly higher on the chain of being were worshipped as gods or goddesses. Thus, rebellious celestials, that is, demons, or angels, were identified as deities, and the uncreated God beyond them all was ignored and forgotten. But for the biblical believers, such celestial beings would be identified as principalities, powers, thrones, demons, etc. In the Bible, the existence of such beings is not denied, but the claims made on their behalf that they are gods in the same way God is, those claims are rejected. Their existence was real. The claims made on their behalf were not. But still, the Bible does not reserve the use of the word God for God alone. God alone is the Most High God, and God alone is the Creator. But the Bible frequently uses the word gods to describe creatures on our side of the creator-creature divide. No use. Here at last the gods have summoned me deathward, and now evil death is close to me, and no longer far away, and there is no way out. So it must long since have been pleasing to Zeus, and Zeus's son, who strikes from afar this way, though before this they defended me gladly. But now my death is upon me. Let me at least not die without a struggle, inglorious, but do some big thing first, that men to come shall know of it. Hector. And the gods of the various nations were closely identified with those nations. When you see this kind of thing in the Iliad, as you will, you're seeing nothing different from what you see in many of the battles of the Old Testament. The gods have their favorites and their loyalties, and they fight for their cities. For example, in the Bible, angelic beings stand behind the nations of Persia and Tyre. This is how the Apostle Paul summed the whole thing up. What am I saying then? That an idol is anything? Or what is offered to idols is anything? Rather, that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to have fellowship with demons. Paul is not maintaining that the Gentiles sacrifice to non-existent beings, but rather to demons masquerading as gods. Thus, we as modern Christians have no reason to dismiss Zeus, Ares, Aphrodite, or Athena. This is very important for the student to remember in reading works like the Iliad. At the same time, and this is equally important, it is not this way anymore. because Christ came into this dark pagan world in order to transform it, which he did. The New Testament speaks of this frequently. So these celestials were, in some significant sense, mediators and princes. But in the Christian eon, God has established just one prince, and he is one of us, a man, the Lord Jesus. We don't follow the ancient cosmology, not because we don't believe that way anymore, but rather because Christ came and changed everything. The fact that the Trojan War occurred in the same world that many of our Old Testament stories did also helps us to understand another significant element in the stories, the important matter of giants. Remember that this is the same general time period as that occupied by Goliath from Gath, the man with a spear like a weaver's beam. It should not be surprising that Homer speaks of Hector's strength in a similar way. Meanwhile, Hector snatched up a stone that stood before the gates and carried it along. Two men, the best in all the community, could not easily hoist it up from a ground to a wagon of men such as men are now, but he alone lifted and shook it. What Homer is telling us here is that giants took to the battlefield back in the day, not like his day. Something to remember when reading accounts of many of these ancient battles is the likelihood that many of the heroes of old were considered such simply because they were huge. In modern warfare, the distinction between generals and foot soldiers is usually that of class, intelligence, experience, and education. But if you stripped them down to their skivvies, their underwear, you would probably have trouble telling which one was the general and which one the corporal. But in ancient warfare, leadership was a matter of personal prowess in battle, and you would have had no trouble telling the general and the private apart at all. Saul was chosen as the first king of Israel, and the choice seemed good to many because he was a full head taller than the rest of them. Goliath was a hero of the Philistines and challenged Israel to produce a similar hero so they could engage in solitary combat. Samson was a judge in Israel, and you could see why at a glance. So it may be helpful, as you are imagining the battles that took place on the plains of Troy, to see the gigantic heroes fighting with one another and the more ordinary, short little guys fighting with one another. The heroes were larger than life in our imaginations and always have been, but they were also larger in life. The world of the Iliad was a world ruled by a warrior caste, a caste which fought for shiny objects, seized beautiful women, lived for honor, and was not really concerned with a quiet and peaceful life. The mentality is that of Achilles, valuing a short and glorious life over against a long and boring one. In our democratic age, a popular phrase with us is that of a level playing field. It's hard to imagine anything in this ancient epic that even resembles a level playing field. The prowess and abilities of the warriors varied widely, as just mentioned. But behind the scenes, skewing things still further in the realm where gods and goddesses intervened, various deities fought for and alongside their favorites. Only Aias fought as a great warrior without the help of any divine on-field coaching. Trying to explain the outcome of a particular battle would therefore have been like trying to predict how a punted football was going to bounce. There are reasons, but none that we have access to. and the ancients after the fact, when they were explaining why things went as they did, would have had no trouble appealing to the intervention of Athena or Ares or Aphrodite. Some of the explanations might have had something to them, while many others were no doubt just convenient. As mentioned earlier, Troy was not conquered in this poem. The story is really not about the fall of Troy at all. Actually, a more accurate name for this epic would be the Iliad, because it's really about the tragedy of Achilles' fall. He is a great hero with high intelligence, but he is governed by his passion for his honor. And this noble sentiment, in the eyes of his culture, carries him away into disaster. A passion for honor was, of course, expected of all ancient heroes, and Achilles was no exception. He was not faulted for that. Zeal for honor was not the problem. He was expected to fight with the enemy for honor and glory. But when he was insulted by Agamemnon, his pride was stung in such a way that he was no longer able to govern himself. A hero was expected to be a sailing ship with great sails, filled with a desire for the immortality of fame. But something went seriously wrong here, and the great winds capsized his ship. When Briseis was taken from Achilles, according to their ancient code of honor, it was reasonable for him to be angry and even to abandon his support of the siege of Troy. He wanted to show how much he was needed and how foolish Agamemnon was for insulting a warrior who was so badly needed by his army. But Achilles stuck to his position long after his legitimate and reasonable point was made. Agamemnon saw the error of his foolish demand, returned Briseis to Achilles with a vow that he had not touched her, and yet Achilles was still unable to let go of his anger. It is the anger of pride, the necessary accompaniment of the warrior's greatness, that springs the tragedy of the Iliad. We see it in the treatment of Hector's body and the slaughter of the captives. We see it motivate the quarrel of the first book, where the fourth word of the first line is anger. Lattimore, page 47. Achilles even admits that he is in the wrong, and yet he is helpless to correct himself. And then, when the Trojans come close to the ships of the Greeks, there is no reason for Achilles to stay out of the fight, even according to the terms he had set down in his angry pride. But he lets Patroclus fight in his place, and as a result, Patroclus dies. Achilles is furious, but he is the reason it happened. But in his anger, he not only kills Hector, he also disgraces his body afterwards. But Patroclus died for two reasons. One, because Hector fought him as an enemy, and second, because Achilles had deserted him as a friend. In short, Achilles' savage anger against Hector is disproportionate and entirely misplaced. Through the chorus of the poem, he spirals downward into a number of actions far beneath where he as a noble warrior ought to have been. His behavior becomes thuggish, and the tragedy is that Achilles was no thug. The story ends with Priam coming to Achilles as a supplicant, asking to ransom Hector's body. Achilles grants the request, and Priam and Achilles weep together. Achilles even provides Priam with a bed and grants the Trojans a 7-day truce so they might conduct Hector's funeral. In this, Achilles relents, but it is not the same as a biblical repentance. There is a hint that he might have recovered from his runaway pride, but the audience still knows what is coming next. Achilles is going to die. Not only will he die, but he will die as a result of an ignoble arrow wound in the heel. Not only will he die of that scarcely heroic wound, but the warrior who shot that deadly arrow will turn out to be Paris, of all people. So the last book in this epic poem could be read as a hint of Achilles recovering his senses, but it could also be read as the ominous silence before the final offstage tragedies. Priam will be returning to the city that will fall and be utterly destroyed. Achilles is. Going to return to the battlefield where he will die at the hand of an adulterer and pretty boy. The rage of Achilles, even though it has abated by the end of the poem, was still going on in its destructive consequences. A secondary hero in this story is Hector, fighting for the Trojans. His temptation is not exactly the same as that of Achilles, but the result of his capitulation to his temptation is exactly the same. He also fights in a way that is far beneath him, and he does so knowing that this is what he's doing. Like Achilles, he knows what is right, but he cannot bring himself to do it. Both Hector and Achilles are trapped. Hector knew that Paris had no right to Helen, and he knew that the Trojans were completely in the wrong to have provided Paris with a refuge and to have taken up his cause as their own. This is what Hector said to Paris about it. No, but the Trojans are cowards in truth, else long before this you had worn a mantle of flying stones for the wrong you did us. Put another way, Hector knew that the Greek cause was just, and that Menelaus had a legitimate grievance with Paris. He knew further that Paris had no right to the protection of Troy, and that Troy provided him with that protection anyway. Troy, and he as the leading prince of Troy, were engaged in fighting an unjust war, and they knew it. Even though it was a defensive war, it could have been averted or stopped at any time if Helen were simply returned to the Greeks. This they refused to do out of pride, and their tragic flaw was thus very similar to the flaw that brought Achilles down. Achilles would not swallow his pride, and Troy would not swallow hers. But Hector himself was motivated more by shame than pride. He was not afraid of battle. He was a fine warrior. But when his wife Andromache begged him not to go back into battle, his reply was revealing. He said he would feel deep shame if, like a coward, he shrank from the fighting. He was no coward in the ordinary sense, but he was afraid of being thought a coward. This fear of shame was deep enough to drive him to fight as an honorable prince in a very dishonorable cause. In studying works like the Iliad, I never tire of reminding my students that this is the world into which Christ came. The astute student should come to see and understand the ancient pagan assumptions that Christ has removed forever, not in order to adopt them himself, but rather to add his own personal amen to the rejection of them. At the same time, there is much that may be appreciated and loved. By God's common grace, the ancient pagans were able to produce literature of unbelievable beauty. That beauty can and should be appreciated. Once understood and appreciated, it may be safely appropriated and put to good use in the service of the kingdom of God. Good writers are not only good readers, they are also readers who read good writing. The early church fathers compared this activity to plundering gold from the Egyptians, taking what is truly valuable from Pharaoh and putting it under the authority of Moses. But we have to be careful in ways that the early Israelites were not. God did give them favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and much gold was in fact given to them by the Egyptians. But that same gold was later used to make a golden calf, which means that many of the Israelites had brought a good deal more out of Egypt than just the gold. This means that the gold can be a temptation, even when it really is gold. Further, it should go without saying that the temptation is even greater when we waste valuable time watching reality TV shows, which can be compared to dumpster diving in Egypt. No gold to be found anywhere. Just a quick note on some of the features of the poetry. The Iliad is epic poetry, which is formulaic poetry. Because it is a very long poem and has the settled meter of dactylic hexameter, the recurrence of certain phrases should not really be a surprise. These phrases recur for the sake of the meter. Brilliant Achilles, crafty Odysseus, white-armed Hera, and so on. Dactylic hexameter is the basic heroic line for the epic in the original Greek. This is very difficult to make work in English, although some have tried from time to time. Here is an approximation of that meter in English. Strawberry, 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 strawberry jam pot. In short, considering this poem as a whole, the Christian student should seek to appreciate and enjoy the beauty of the poetry, appreciating what is noble and good about it. But he should not be fooled. C.S. Lewis said somewhere that the genius of Homer took the granite of despair and shined it up to look like marble. Essay by Douglas Wilson. Judgment of Paris was created by the artist Peter Paul Rubens and was commissioned for the Spanish court. The oil on canvas painting was completed in 1638-39 and now hangs in the Museum del Prado in Madrid. Aphrodite is in the center and is supposedly a likeness of the artist's wife. Peter Paul Rubens was quite a prolific Flemish painter in the 17th century. His paintings, often of mythological themes, tended to emphasize color and sensuality. Session 3, Aesthetics. In this session, you'll get to know a particular piece of or type of art related to our reading. It's our job as believers to be able to praise, love, and protect what is beautiful and to condemn, hate, and oppose all that is truly ugly. This task is often harder than we think. We have to discipline ourselves to first examine and understand the piece reflectively. After we understand the content of a piece, we can examine the author's intention concerning the piece and attempt to figure out what the piece of art is communicating. Sometimes this will be easy, other times it will be difficult or impossible. Finally, we need to make a judgment about what this work of art communicates. Sometimes we will be able to clearly condemn a work of art as untrue, badly done, or wicked. Sometimes we will be able to praise a work as glorious, majestic, and true. Oftentimes, however, we will find ourselves affirming some parts of a work and condemning others. Remember, maturity is harder than immaturity, but also more rewarding. Also remember that our praise or condemnation means more when we have disciplined ourselves to first reflect on the content and the meaning of a work. The request. And Priam and Achilles weep together. Achilles even provides Priam with a bed and grants the Trojans a 7-day truce so they might conduct Hector's funeral. In this, Achilles relents, but it is not the same as a biblical repentance. There is a hint that he might have recovered from his runaway pride, but the audience The judgment of Paris was a favorite subject for Lucas Cranach the Elder, 1472 to 1553, as well as many other artists throughout history like Picasso, Burne-Jones, Raimondi, Feuerbach, Dali, and Rubens. A good friend of Martin Luther's, Cranach is also known for his religious art, including woodcuts that he made for the first German edition of the New Testament in 1952. Compare the Cranach rendition of the Judgment of Paris to Rubens's. How do the artist's depictions of costume in these paintings affect the way we relate to them? This is a detail from The Loves of Paris and Helen by neoclassical French painter Jacques-Louis David, 1748 to 1825. In the full painting, a statue of Aphrodite is included as well as 2 wreaths of myrtle, an emblem of conjugal fidelity. In a preliminary drawing for the painting, Cupid flew near the lovers to further underscore the theme of love in the artwork. All right, Session 6, Debate. The story of the Trojan War is told by several writers of the ancient world, and the details are not always the same. Remember Herodotus from Omnibus 1, the father of history? He claims that Paris never made it back to Troy with Helen. Rather, their ship was blown off course and landed in Egypt. When the Greeks arrived at Troy and demanded the return of Helen, the Trojans were actually telling the truth when they said she was not there. The Greeks, thinking the Trojans were mocking them, attacked, burned the city, and only then discovered that Helen was not there. Menelaus then went to Egypt, recovered his bride, and returned to Sparta. Euripides throws a fascinating twist to the story in his play, Helen, claiming that because Hera was so upset in not being chosen the fairest of all, she gave Paris a ghost-like image of Helen, an airy delusion that fooled him enough into carrying it, back to Troy. Hermes carried off the real Helen to Egypt to remain pure until her husband could arrive and rescue her. After sacking the city of Troy, Menelaus was blown off course and landed in, yes, you guessed it, Egypt. A common theme in the ancient world was getting blown off course and landing in Egypt. When he realized that the real Helen was there, he quickly broke up with the ghost version and made away with his bride back to Sparta. So what really happened? We're going to have a debate over what is the most believable version of the story. Since we do not know for sure what actually transpired, we're debating with which makes the most sense. If you're working alone, choose either Homer or Herodotus. Write down your arguments and share your conclusions. Before you share your arguments, make sure to explain the issue of the debate to your family. Be ready to answer questions concerning the strong points for the other side of the argument. Here's the structure of the debate. Opening statement, Homer. Herodotus questions Homer. Opening statement, Herodotus. Homer questions Herodotus. Rebuttals when necessary. Closing statement, Homer. Closing statement, Herodotus. And here are some ideas. There's also a creative writing task. Write your alternate version of the story, your own alternate version that you believe explains all the facts. Session 10, Writing. Dear Aphrodite. Throughout the Iliad, we see that the gods and goddesses are influencing men to do and say things. In the reading you just completed, Zeus sends Iris to influence Hector's decisions, Book 11, and also inspires Sarpedon in Book 12. In Book 2, Zeus sends Agamemnon a dream in an attempt to encourage him to attack. And in Book 3, Aphrodite saves Paris from certain death at the hands of Menelaus. But who is it that is actually influencing humans when false gods are doing this? Paul discusses the true nature of false gods in 1 Corinthians 10, calling them demons. So when false gods communicate with men, it is really demons communicating with men. We know that demons do not have man's best interests at heart. C.S. Lewis provides striking insight into the communications and plans of demons in his book, The Screwtape Letters. In this book, an elder demon, Screwtape, writes letters advising his nephew Wormwood as to how to manipulate his patient. You may remember this book from Omnibus 1. So we are going to write a letter from one demon, let's call him Zeus, to another, advising him on how to manipulate humans to bring about their desired ends. Choose an incident from books 1 to 12 in which a god or goddess has intervened in the affairs of man. Remember, this is a behind the curtain view of what's really going on. What we read in Homer's perspective, and he certainly did not have our insight that these gods were actually demonic forces. In your letter, be sure to include the advice coming from the higher demon and also the true why of the action, not the reason given in the story. You also might want to include a section in which the elder demon is advising as to how the action should come across to the poets as they write their epics. And session 11, writing, Homeric similes. One of the fascinating aspects to Homer's work is his unique use of the simile. When we use similes, we typically use the words like or as we end it in one phrase. For example, he shouted like a crazed beast after sacking the quarterback. Not Homer. As you may have noticed, Homer's similes often go on and on and on and on and on. Read these examples from the Iliad and then answer the questions that follow. A description of the army moving out and preparing for battle. So he spoke and led the way, departing from the council. And the rest rose to their feet, the sceptred kings obeying, the shepherd of the people, and the army thronged behind them, like the swarms of clustering bees that issue forever in fresh bursts from the hollow in the stone, and hang like bunch grapes as they hover beneath the flowers in springtime, fluttering in swarms together this way and that way, so the many nations of men from the ships and the shelters along the front of the deep sea beach marched in order by companies to the assembly, and so forth.